In this video, I'm going to kit bash some miniatures using bits and pieces scavenged from around my workshop. Some may consider them to be monstrosities, but hopefully, they're cool monstrosities. Over the years, I've accumulated some leftover bits. I'm always looking for ways to use them. They always seem to come in faster than I can get rid of them. Today, I decided to mix and match as many of these bits and pieces as possible to make a cohesive combat patrol, or something like it. Represented here are Star Wars Legion clones, some not dwarven dwarves from Age of Sigmar. Bought those a while back to make my Snow White and the Seven Dwarves diorama, but Snow White is a juggernaut. And I'm also going to be using some bits and pieces from historical kits. I looked through everything I had that was in about the same scale, trying to find bits and pieces that I could mix and match, creating something that was interesting, but not too recognizable as any one of the armies that it was made from. In the end, I found 9 torsos with legs from Star Wars Legion, which were a nice starting place. But a lot of them looked too much like clones at this point, mostly because of those pauldrons. So the first thing I did was to remove those. Once those were off, I could then start adding arms and a head. And the Space Marine arms that I started with were a little too bulky and long for this pose specifically. Kind of made him look like a gorilla. So I looked around and found something more size appropriate, and that was some Krieg arms. Speaking of Krieg arms, you should go watch the Krieg arm short that I made. Krieg arm shorts is a new category of shorts it's not trending on YouTube, but it might, it may, if you go watch it. Many of the bits that you'll see me using today were actually supplied by patrons or viewers of the channel who sent me their bits to use in kit bashing. A lot of which are difficult to use in my normal kit bashing scenarios, so that was one of the reasons I wanted to build this little army. Get to use some of those that have just been burning a hole in my bits box. If you see a bit that you supplied, huge shout out to you. I really appreciate it. I gave this first guy a holstered sidearm, and then I dug around in my bits box for a hand that looked like it was in the ready position for a quick draw. For the primary weapon, I decided to go with the sword. I snipped that away from its original owner, careful to not damage the guard, and then I glued that to the hand that used to be holding a lance. And speaking of lances, I thought that these Krieg Tiki Torch flag lances would be fun and quirky additions to go on the backpacks of a few of these guys. I bought a bunch of extra bases, as well as some basing bits from Gamer's Grass. I'm all about custom basing, and had I had more time, I might have kit bashed the bases as well, but because I had these little basing bits, I thought I might as well use them. After the first guy had been glued down to his base, it was time to move on to the next one. I went ahead and just started with Krieg arms this time. Actually, most of the guys from here on out will have Krieg arms. If you're not sure what I'm saying when I say Krieg arms, Krieg is a faction from Warhammer 40,000, and arms are an appendage. The third guy was kneeling, so I gave him that classic kneeling and pointing pose. And this Space Marine helmet was a little too big, made him look kind of like a kid in a Halloween costume. So I swapped that out and started removing material from the chest. The reason I had to remove material is because I had a new head with a beard that I wanted to put on this guy. That head is from the box of Not Dwarven Dwarves from Age of Sigmar. And his chest was a little too muscular before, so I had to remove that before the beard would fit in place. Now that I'm looking at it, I probably shouldn't have put the dwarven head on the kneeling guy, because now he just does look like a dwarf. But he's not short, at least that's what he tells people. He's just kneeling. The next guy was in the most action-y pose of everybody, which meant that the oversized claw arm and Space Marine arm didn't look out of place or like overkill, because of the motion, I guess. He got a bearded Space Wolf head, which was left over from my Warhammer Cowboy Army build. He also got a cool necklace with some bones and teeth on it. The pose lent itself very well to a jetpack, so I hooked him up with one of those. And the next miniature was a Galactic Rebel, who also got Krieg arms and a Space Wolf head. But this one had a mohawk, which kind of made him look a little cyberpunky. I was running out of good left arms, so I gave this guy a shield, which looks cool, but definitely makes him stand out from the rest of the minis. And I'm about to add something to his head in a little bit that will make that even worse, but I don't know, he's pretty cool looking. My favorite of the Kit Bashed minis today is probably this guy, who got a nice big battle axe, also a hooded eliminator head, which makes him look kind of like a executioner or something. And just for good measure, I also gave him a huge Bowie knife. Of course, he also got the Tiki Torch treatment and the Dwarven Pauldrons. Then I threw him on a base and the soldiers were done. Well, they were almost done. I went back and added antlers from Pete the Wargamer's Animal Bits box to this guy so that he stood out just a little bit more than he needed to. As I was looking through the Warhammer Combat Patrol boxes, I realized they were all missing something important, and that's the Komatsu G40 bulldozer. My army will not be missing one. Along with the model kit, I also grabbed a nice large base. This should be the perfect size for this weapon of war. And now we've reached the fine scale modeling section of the video, where we break away from assembling little army men to assembling construction equipment. I'm not sure why I felt this group needed a Tonkatsu G40 as its support vehicle, but it was about the right size and it looked like it could take some 40,000th millennial weapons pretty well. In other words, of the vehicles that I had on hand, I felt like this one would survive the conversion better than most. After it had been glued down to its base, it was time to decide on the weapons. After looking over these weapons from a dreadnought from the Horus Heresy, I settled on these cannons right here. I was trying to think through why these cannons would be the best to go on here, but in the end I decided not to try and come up with a reason, other than that they just looked the coolest. There's really no need to try and justify decisions made when converting a bulldozer into whatever this thing is. I added a few more bits, including a tiki torch and some menacing teeth on the front, and then it was time to glue the driver in place. He's just your average hardworking guy. No need for any conversions. Next, I coated the base with some mud effects from AK, and once that was appropriately textured, the kit bashing and construction phase of this build was done, and then it was finally time to move on to the paint. You may have noticed this one guy who was already primed black. He was actually a test model that I made last week. I didn't know if this idea was good enough to make into a whole video. Maybe it's not. But I had enough fun while making him that I wanted to make a bunch more. After priming the rest of the minis black, I gave them a layer of light gray sprayed from above in the form of a zenithal highlight. And after that, it was time to start painting with a brush. Initially, the plan was a much more yellowish green, much more subdued color palette. So I gave the armor and the bulldozer a coat of Agaros Dunes, which is a contrast paint from Citadel. I then switched to another contrast paint called Garagok's Sewer, which is an unpleasant name, and I actually have no idea if I pronounced that correctly. I used that to paint the treads and the cannons. I then moved back to the soldiers and wrapped up the base coats with more contrast paints that I don't necessarily know how to pronounce. And finally, I gave the recesses and the lower sections of the model a coat of thinned down blue wash to bring some vibrancy and saturation back into the shadows. I hit a couple spots with dark purple as well. At this point, the minis had their base coats, except for the faces, and they were looking pretty good. But now it's time to break out the wet palette and go in a completely different direction with the armor than I had started with. I decided I wanted more saturation in the green on my mini's armor, so that's what I did. Recently, I've expanded my limited palette to include the secondaries as well as the primaries. Just the primaries on their own tended to get too gray too quickly, probably just due to a lack of pure pigment. So if I was able to find more highly pigmented paints, primaries would probably be able to be used as they were, but Adding the secondaries definitely helps maintain saturation, especially in value jumps. The green color was getting a little close to Halo Spartan green, so hopefully as I add other colors, it will start to veer away from that. Never mind, that guy looks exactly like Master Chief. Because most of the painting process was the same from soldier to soldier, I mostly just focused in on this guy with the big battle axe. He had almost every element that anybody else did, except skin, a hair, or a beard. But don't worry, I did get footage of painting those things, and that will pop up in a minute. As I work my way around this miniature and pick out the details, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons, and I'm going to stop talking for a minute and just let you watch and enjoy the process. Quickly slap some paint on the base. I'll be covering all of that up later with some pigment powders. But that was this guy wrapped up, and it was time to move on to the rest of the crew. You may have noticed that I'm getting a lot more paint on my thumb or the back of my hand recently. And that's not just because my aim is getting worse. I actually figured out why other painters do that. So I've been doing it as well. It's to check the consistency of the flow of the paint as it comes off the brush. You want to make sure that it's the right consistency before you put it down on the model, rather than put it down and find out, which is a mistake I've made many, many times. So I've been doing it more recently, and it's very quickly become a habit. And I kind of like it. At this point, I just moved around from miniature to miniature, picking out those unique details that they didn't necessarily share with the others. I batch painted all of the armor. But at this stage, I worked my way around to like the feathers and the hair and the faces. I just really had fun rendering each of those individually. And that of course included some cool weapons as well. After the soldiers, I moved on to the bulldozer tank, giving it the same saturation treatment as the soldiers and picking out each of the details one by one. I have no idea what the lore for this faction even is, but they have mostly clone body armor, Krieg arms, Space Marine heads, and a variety of weapons. So if you feel so inclined, you can write some lore and let me know what the faction should be called in the comment section. I'll try and read through everything and pick my favorite. With the painting done, the last step was to add some pigment powders to the base to tie everybody together and put them in the same environment. After mixing the pigments up with water, I generously applied them to the base, feathering them up onto the lower sections of all of the models. Then I went back in afterward with some pure water just to help ease that transition just a little bit more gently. Once that was dry, the last thing to do was to go back in and paint the rims of each of the bases with a pure black. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.